Welcome back to Mystara for the last of the Gazetteer remasters, as we look at Alphatia, the second half of the Dawn of the Emperor's box set. This is the magical empire, the foil to Thyatis, sitting on the smallest of Mystara's 4 continents. The empire is famous for bristling with magic of all sorts, its segregated society, and its almost dysfunctional government. It's one of the most powerful nations on the planet, capable of conquering anybody just as long as they somehow get their hundreds of powerful wizards to actually get off their duffs and do something. I'm Mr. Welch, and take me down to the Alphatian Empire, where the girls are light blue and... Vampire Empire? Umpire Empire? Bonfire Empire? Hold on just a second. Where's my Queensryche cassette? Here we go. Song 6. East side meets west side downtown. No time, no line. The walls fell down. Can't you feel it coming? Empire. Can't you hear it coming? Empire. Can't someone here stop it? Okay, if Jeff Tate can't cleanly rhyme empire with anything, then the word can't be cleanly rhymed. So moving on. Alphatia first appeared in the module Test of the Warlords, where its province of Norwald played a huge part in the Companion and Master level series of modules. Then all that got retconned when the nation actually got its own box set. To briefly summarize, Alphatia was an empire located on another plane of existence when a squabble between 2 schools of magic caused a major magical civil war that eventually tore the planet apart. So more of a tiff then. The survivors came to Mystara through magical portals, conquered what would become the continent of Alphatia, and went around conquering various lands to reestablish their empire. Then it all went to pot. I'm not counting anything that came before Dawn of the Emperors due to the major changes that were created with the box set. Norwald doesn't become a breakaway province, there's no Thyacian invasion of Norwald, and Empress Ariadne and Emperor Thenkal most certainly do not end up trapped in another dimension together and end up becoming a couple before adventurers go and rescue them and come back with some beef jerky made from their flesh so they can be resurrected on the prime material plane. Yeah, Talons of Night was a weird one, so we're not going to bring it up again. Much like Thyatis, Alphatia would have benefited greatly from having its own box set. It's massive in scope, and it was hampered by Dawn's relatively low page count and having to share the book with Thyatis. There are numerous nations inside of the Empire, so many that several are only mentioned on the map, and others don't even get anything of a note in their description. A large amount of what we know about the various kingdoms in any detail come from the almanacs, and those were set after Alphatia had been destroyed on the surface. Alphatia is ruled by spellcasters, though anyone that can cast magic is part of the nobility rather than just wizards like in Glantry. Clerics, druids, wizards, and even more exotic classes like humanoid Wakani can be a noble. Half-caster classes like paladins, rangers, and bards were suggested not to qualify as spellcasters in the 2nd edition sourcebooks, but they never flat-out said that paladins can't be nobility in Alphatia. Even if they can't be nobility, they will at least be treated better than classes with no magic at all. 2nd edition Mystara was a mess of a conversion, and 2nd edition Alphatia was no different. The Empire is racially diverse, with all demi-humans present, and a large number of humanoids and even intelligent monsters. If a creature can cast magic and behave itself, it's welcomed with open arms. If it can't cast magic and can behave itself, it's a second-class citizen. If it can cast magic and can't behave itself, it gets sent to Blackheart, where they're used to that sort of stuff. If it can't cast magic and can't behave itself, then it gets used for target practice. Rule of thumb is to be on your best behavior in Alphatia. Alphatians as a stereotype are self-absorbed. The nation's alignment is typically considered chaotic neutral. People want to be left alone so they can do their own thing. The most powerful wizards can't be bothered to help other people because they have other things to do. While this means the population enjoys freedoms other nations can only dream of, it also means the nation has a serious problem with apathy. To give a full history, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, the Alphatians were a highly magical breed of humans that commanded magics that rivaled even that of the immortals, at least according to them. Almost everybody was a wizard, and the few that weren't were trained to be the pinnacle of the human form. The Alphatians started to build their empire, first conquering all the lands around them, and then quickly the entire planet. And then they started plane hopping and conquering those people. Apparently, conquering people without magic was the Alphatian pastime. They conquered the nation of Cyprus and found their population to be physically fit and, more importantly, compliant. The pure-strained Alphatians, known for their light blue skin, pitch-black hair, and blue eyes, began to interbreed with the coppery-skinned Cyprians, creating the common Alphatians found today. Alphatia had such an easy time of it that, with their magics and their vast number of slaves providing them everything they needed, that its people began to look for activities to keep them from becoming bored. It was then they discovered the plant Zonga, a fruit that reduced wizards to a euphoric stupor for days on end. It would become the bane of the empire that still plagues it today. As more wizards fell under the addictive fruit's effects, the more divided the society became between the wizards that did stuff and the wizards that just sat around and zoned out. Soon conquered territories began rebelling as the number of wizards available to keep them conquered just wasn't there anymore. Of the wizards that weren't reduced to the fantasy equivalent of slow-mo addicts, they began to form into philosophical schools that took disagreements quite seriously, like starting wars over a difference of opinion serious. Eventually, two great schools of thought emerged. The School of Air, who was known for building a lot of skyships and using their magic to make Alphatian space between its worlds breathable, and the School of Fire, who proved their superiority by setting anyone who disagreed with them alight. The two schools of philosophy were bitter rivals, and people died by the score in their feud. This conflict excited the normally bored Alphatians. They couldn't get enough of the arguments and the fights that ensued. Finally, somebody asked them which element was superior as part of a scholarly debate. That's when things went horribly wrong. Turns out the emperor at the time was Alphax I, who was a fire worshipper. He took it upon himself to judge the contest fairly, meaning he at least let the followers of air give their presentation before declaring the followers of fire the winner. The air worshippers then filed a protest against the unfair officiating of the event by leveling the followers of Fire University with tornadoes. Alphax responded by outlawing the air sect for this deed, while the followers of fire started burninating everybody that followed the air sect. Alphax made things worse by pardoning the burninators. Cue Civil War. In the years of carnage that followed, most of Alphatia's colonies were either burninated or hurricaneated to death. When Alphax tried to make peace, the fire worshippers overthrew him and stepped up the war. The air followers decided to end the war by casting a spell on a scale unheard of, and this was the spell that hurricaneated the entire planet, tearing it to pieces. As the air sect destroyed their own world before the fire sect could do it, the air sect was technically the winner. Or it would have been if everybody wasn't fleeing in terror because the world was being destroyed. The air followers fled to Mystara during the destruction of their planet, as the spell that hurricaneated the world took years to tear it to chunks. They found themselves on what is now the Alphatian continent, and started shaping the land with their magics to make it more like their homeworld. Unknown to the air sect, many fire worshippers escaped to Mystara as well, but avoided Alphatia, preferring to establish new identities and settle far away from their former countrymen. Alphatia landed in Mystara about 1400 years after Blackmoor exploded, and found themselves alone on the New World, with no other civilizations to be found. There were people living on the Alphatian continent when the air followers arrived, but as these people couldn't prevent themselves from being quickly conquered by the massive number of wizards marching through portals, they don't count. Because if they were civilized, they wouldn't be slaves, would they? Alphatians soon found that magic worked differently in Mystara, so they had to relearn all their spells. Most of their magic items, artifacts, and similar luxuries were left behind in old Alphatia, meaning that Alphatians actually had to do manual labor for the first time in a long time. Well, they would have if it wasn't for all these handy lesser peoples just standing around outside their borders. Nearly every aspect of the new Alphatian Empire was built with slave labor. If they didn't have a spell for building a wall, then they just had the slaves do it for them. The first Alphatian emperor, Karathar I, met with several dozen of the most powerful wizards and set up a new form of government. He would still be the emperor, but his power would be kept in check by the Grand Council of Wizards, 1,000 of the most powerful wizards in Alphatia. They could overrule him with a majority vote, but he got to replace the ones that died from the ranks of the available wizards. Because Alphatia has more than 1,000 wizards of the highest level just standing around reading the newspaper waiting their turn. This is where most Mystara players break from the lore, because if Alphatia had 1,000 wizards of what would be 36th level running the government, then the Empire could quickly conquer the planet. The lore that is generally agreed upon now is that the Council's reputation is pure propaganda. There's a lot of wizards on the Council, but only a fraction of them actually take part in the politics. They aren't all maximum level. That part about the Grand Council is what we in the Phaeacian legions call a lie. Any wizard with enough political pull can be nominated to the Council regardless of level. And of course, being Alphatian, many of the wizards on the Council can't be torn away from their own studies and do their job. More than a few archmages have forgotten they're even on the Council, not having attended any meetings in decades. But since non-attendance is not grounds for removal, the majority of the Council is a part of it in name only. The prevailing belief among the majority of the Council's wizards is that somebody else will handle the problems, that their tasks are far too important to be disturbed. That bit of retconning was even adopted by some of the people that wrote the original Mystara books, allowing a glaring power imbalance to be fixed without massively retconning a major part of the setting. Alphatia's reliance on slaves came to bite them hard in the coming centuries. The imperial family became obsessed with the purity of the noble lines, so the pure Alphatians, those with blue skin, black hair, and black, blue, or purple eyes, were only allowed to breed with others of their kind. So the Alphatians began to get what happens when your family tree doesn't branch. The emperors became insane, sickly, and the 7th and 8th seasons of their stories felt compacted and rushed and didn't provide any kind of payoff for the audience. Compounding this was the Alphatian dislike for physical labor, so slaves did all the labor, built their homes, and served in the army to protect them. And slaves don't fight very hard for their masters, it turns out. With the soldiers' loyalty more to their homelands rather than the Empire in general, it became increasingly easy for barbarians to raid the Empire with little resistance. To make matters worse, a family from old Alphatia managed to bring the Zonga fruit with them. The plant wouldn't grow in Mystaran soil normally, but the family created magical greenhouses that let the plant flourish. After centuries of trying to eradicate the drug, one emperor instead legalized it and heavily taxed it. During this time, somebody managed to modify the plant to grow naturally in Mystara, and soon it addicted huge chunks of Alphatian nobility. The Alphatian Empire was back to where it started, with just a handful doing the work for the majority of the nobility. It was during this decline that Alphatia was constantly being raided by Phaeacian privateers. They were little more than pests to the wizards, who were happy just blasting their ships out of the water when they encountered one, but then the Alphatians discovered that Thyatis itself was mineral rich, especially with gold. So the Alphatians decided they had enough of the Phaeacians and sent a massive army to conquer and enslave them. That's when they found out the Phaeacians were very good at waging war. The first Alphatian army was sent with very little magic support, as the wizards didn't think some petty conquest of another barbarian tribe was worth their time. The Phaeacians slaughtered them on the beaches. So the emperor sent over a second army, this time with a lot of wizards. The Phaeacians were conquered and spent the next 2 centuries as slaves. The Phaeacian revolt was only a matter of time. It happened on the 1000th anniversary of the Alphatian arrival, as Emperor Karathor IV was spending all the gold the empire had on a massive celebration. Gold that was needed to pay troops. Long story short, and to avoid repeating what I said in the Phaeacian video, Thyatis defeated Alphatia through treachery and violent conflict. Emperor Karathor was overthrown, and Emperor Alphas VI made peace with his former slaves. The empire began to rebuild, and under the influence of the wizard Myler Tyndall started a trend to create elaborate and beautiful buildings and cities to reflect the strength of the empire. Her teachings are still held today, as Alphatians prefer form over function in most of their architecture. She's actually still alive, serving as a professor at the University of Aesla. The empire curtailed its rapid expansion, with its last addition to the empire being a colonization effort rather than conquest, bringing Norwald into the imperial territories. The last great battle between Alphatia and Thyatis was the Spike Invasion, which again I've covered in the Thyatis video. The Alphatian point of view was that Thyatis was becoming aggressive and needed to be reminded of Alphatia's power. The invasion was going well until the common citizens of Thyatis, as well as its fighting slaves, counterattacked the invasion force, catching them by surprise and routing them from the capital. The Phaeacian emperor was killed in the invasion, but the Alphatian emperor was forced to abdicate due to his failure of leadership. Now 2 new rulers sit on the thrones, each one unsure of the other's intentions. Alphatia's government is broken down into a series of kingdoms that were conquered and absorbed into the empire. Each nation is ruled by a king or a queen, which by law must be a spellcaster of some kind. This law is loosened the further away from the capital, so that the furthest colonies are ruled over by royalty without any magical abilities. On the continent, every ruler is a wizard or a cleric, but in surrounding nations, rulers with only marginal abilities aren't unheard of, especially in the smaller nations. If a king or queen dies without an heir, or only has children without magical abilities, then the empress will select a new monarch from the available spellcasters in that particular nation. One thing people will immediately notice looking at the map of Alphatia is there's a lot of forts and defensive lines that separate many of the kingdoms. One of the most obvious is a massive wall more than 150 miles in length that separates the kingdom of Haven and the imperial nation of Erdelok. The nation of Randall is lined by a 240-long-mile wall on its border with Thrandural, and a large number of forts, castles, and defensive structures with its northern neighbor of Betalin. While wars between the Alphatian nations are forbidden, in times of weak emperors, the laws of Alphatia don't mean much. Throw in numerous slave revolts and attempted coups, and there are long lingering grudges held by many of the nations. While Empress Ariadne has the loyalty of the empire for now, many of her predecessors couldn't be bothered to actually rule and became self-absorbed while the empire threatened to tear itself apart with internal strife. Many of the old conflicts have been settled, but the fortifications left from those wars still remain. Alphatian society is highly stratified. There are different sets of laws for nobles and commoners. Murder by a commoner results in all their possessions being seized, followed by an execution. Murder of a commoner by a noble results in a fine, paid to the decedent's heirs. Reduction to slavery is a constant threat for commoners. Even insulting nobles above the rank of prince gets you enslaved. Magic-using Alphatians are provided the best education the empire can provide, even if they are the children of slaves. Commoners must have their parents pay for their education. Because nobility is tied to spellcasting abilities, there's no way for a commoner to rise in social status short of leaving the empire. Because of the vast disparity between the classes, Alphatia makes it a priority to keep the masses entertained. The empire is infused with magic. Well, not as much as Glantry. There's no escaping spells and magical items that are used in day-to-day life in the larger cities. Trials are short because of the use of various spells to immediately know the truth, and as such, thieves' guilds are unheard of in Alphatia. Clerical magic is openly on sale. Healing is so common that disabilities are immediately cured. If someone is disabled, they can't contribute to the well-being of the nation. Likewise, mental illnesses are quickly healed once discovered. Alphatians have no privacy from divination spells, as the state takes precedence over any individual rights when it comes to national security. The noble Alphatians are known for being a flighty lot, obsessed with their various hobbies, studies, and pet projects. They are used to luxuries other nations can't even imagine. Their homes are filled with labor-saving magical devices. They're waited on hand and foot by slaves. And as long as they pay their taxes, they are left alone by the government. The fact that most of their nobles have no interest at all in the operations of their own nation is a major problem for the Empire. In times of national emergency, the number of wizards available to help is often insufficient for the task. They just assume somebody else is going to help. The Alphatian commoners tend to be a complacent lot, more concerned about not being noticed by the nobility than worrying about improving their status. They can't exactly revolt, despite outnumbering the nobility thousands to one. Nothing motivates the wizards faster than a peasant revolt. If they do their job, then the nobles won't even remember who they are. If they do their job well, then they might be hired for custom tasks by a member of the nobility. The issue with that is, when two nobles want your services, you have to tell one of them no. That's not the healthiest option. Commoners work hard at their jobs, and they spend their free time drinking in taverns or watching sports. Check out the sports video for more information on that. Alphatian kingdoms come on a large variety of different governments. Many of them keep the traditions of the original cultures before they were conquered by the Alphatians centuries ago. Others have long since adopted the Alphatian culture for their own, and some of the governments were created as a social experiment. Alphatia has its own version of Common, which is a trade tongue based on the Alphatian tongue, obviously. Speaking Thracian Common in Alphatia is a good way to draw some suspicious stares, if not mark yourself as a target for criminal types. Alphatia, like I said, needed to be its own book or box set. There are numerous kingdoms found on the map that don't appear in the Alphatian book. Many of them are mentioned in the almanacs, but that was after Alphatia was whisked away to the Hollow World, so the setting was completely changed. The nations not mentioned at all in their own book include Friesland, a frozen wilderness where the monsters roam outside the cities. Forest Home you would think is an elven kingdom, but that's left to the imagination as it gets no mention at all. The imperial territories make up the center of the continent, and is nothing but untouched wilderness left unsettled until one of the emperors decides to award it to someone. Thranduil is run by Princess Eldrathila, but nothing else is known. Eadrin, Randall, and Betalin get almost no mention, which is a shame because the capital of Betalin is Citadel, a fortress carved from a mountain. The entire mountain is the fortress, something you would think people would talk about. Of the nations that were mentioned, Haven was founded by a wizard named Aesla, who made it a place for the common Alphatians, as the emperor was all into forced breeding but with the noble Alphatians. It's known for having a large population of common Alphatians, but it's also the largest seaport in the empire. East of that is Vertalocht, the imperial capital territory. It's sparsely populated outside the capital of Sunsval, as all the residences are vast estates with few people living in each one. South of Haven is Greenspur, which is the largest naval base in Alphatia, and has one of the largest populations of commoners due to the numerous jobs as sailors and shipbuilders. Northwest Alphatia is home to Trollhättan, which shares its name with a troll region in the Broken Lands. Here every type of humanoid and sentient monster can be found, and if they can cast magic, they're considered nobles. The capital of Lulm is home to a large zoo filled with almost every type of magical creature, though the city is also known for being one of the most dangerous towns in Alphatia. The nation of Stonewall holds the reputation as the one kingdom on the continent that extends equal rights to commoners, though not officially. But commoner law is so lax here that most wizards live somewhere else to avoid having to share benches with the lowborn. Stoutfellow is comprised of gnomes and dwarves, and are allowed to live on their own as long as they keep making trade good for the other kingdoms. The ruling is split between dwarven clerics and gnomish wizards, but there is little class difference between either race. Northeastern Alphatia is cold but beautiful, known for its unspoiled scenery, and it's popular with druids, elves, and others that appreciate natural beauty. The nation of Amber is sparsely populated outside the city of Starpoint, which is filled with observatories and theaters. It's a strange mix of science and art that was intentionally created by the Queen, who enjoys both hobbies. Floating R is one of the most famous kingdoms in all of Alphatia, as the Wizard R levitated the entire nation where it now resides. The floating part of R is populated mainly by wizards from the followers of Air, who create their sky ships and practice air magic. Lower R is where the commoners live, making goods and growing food for the wizards above. Southeastern Alphatia is showcased by the undersea kingdom of Aquis. It's a giant dome city where only hand-picked wizards and their slaves are allowed. Here rules Empress Ariadne's old flame and father of her 2 spellcasting children. It's less of a kingdom and more of a city, where everybody is free to do what they want unless you're indentured. Because then you have to do what you're told, because the punishments here can be quite unpleasant. Because a man chooses, a slave obeys. Araganza is mostly plantations and vineyards, except for the capital of Bluenose, where you will find some of the wealthiest nobles in all of Alphatia living it up, while watching the lower classes till the fields. Central Alphatia is home to Shilar, the elven kingdom that they decide to talk about. The elves here are distantly related to their Alfheim cousins, but far more isolated. If you aren't elven, you aren't welcome. They build their cities deep in the nation and patrol the borders to keep out trespassers. Despite this, the elves are quite loyal to the Empress, and will report to her immediately of any threat to her or the Empire. Blackheart was covered in its own video. But in short, this is Bad Guy Land, ruled by King Evil McNaughtybad. Well, that's not his real name, but it might as well be. Here, all sorts of nasty spells are researched, new monsters are created, and assassins can advertise their profession openly. If you need to hire a bad guy, this is where you do it. Except the Dark Lord Meridoth. That guy was too evil even for these guys. They might be necromancers, warlocks, and liches, but they're necromancers, warlocks, and liches with standards, thank you very much. Being an empire, of course Alphatia has territory outside of its continent, as despite Ariadna reigning in the expansionistic tendencies, they didn't abandon their previous holdings, even expanding onto the continent of Brune, with one of the most famous regions in D&D, Norwald, the Canada of Mystara. Here her son Ericol tries to prove to his mom that he's not as incompetent as his brother Xandar. He's correct in that claim, he's nowhere near as incompetent, he's only slightly incompetent, but he's light years ahead of Xandar when it comes to ruling. The island of Belisaria lies southeast of Alphatia. It's about the same size, but somehow counts as an island, while Alphatia is a continent. There are 6 nations in Belisaria, though the map over at Thorfinn's place has 9 delineated by borders. The box set only names 2 of them. The almanacs give the names for Dawnrim, Horkin, Lagrius, and Notrion. Mariendar is known for its alchemists and its sages. The nation of Surshield is a large military base that protects the island from an attack coming from the continent of Skothar. It's known for its anarchistic nature, and there are by law no other laws. As you can expect, this is a rough and rowdy location. The rest of the island is dominated by agriculture, and it provides the majority of the food for the empire. The undefined nations are hinted at being boring, uninteresting places to visit that just make food. The Aladian Islands were 4 islands turned over to artists to try to make something special out of them. Aegos failed at this task and reverted back to being mostly farms. Aria built a university and devoted itself to the study of the plane of air, becoming one of the biggest sources on the subject in Mystara. Gaiety turned into a theme park and resort, though only the nobles can really afford it. Ne'er-do-well has turned into a social experiment. All non-violent crime was made legal, and the king sat back and watched the fun. It's a notorious den for pirates, who actually obey the few laws the nation has, because they don't want to get kicked out of the one nation that will have them. Alphatia claims half the Isle of Dawn, with a quarter of the island being contested by Thyatis. This is where they fight their proxy wars, allowing the armies to test their mettle, but without blowing up into another full-scale war. See the video on the Isle of Dawn for a far more involved review, so you don't have to listen to me repeat myself. The other holdings of Alphatia include the Yanavi chain of islands and Quiadar, which are sparsely populated and mostly inhospitable. And then there's Esterhold. This holding is one of Alphatia's darker secrets, as it's their only holding on the continent of Skothar. It is mostly populated by Genite slaves being forced to work themselves to death in the mines for the benefit of Alphatia. The cruelty of the slave masters and the sheer death toll of the slaves would shock most nobles to the core, but the minerals they provide means most nobles pretend they don't know what really goes on there. So why do you want to play an Alphatian? Their unreliability is the stuff of legend. They're easily distracted, and their social stratification makes them hard to relate to in other nations. But they are a varied people. They value their personal freedom more than just about anybody else. If the wizards can be convinced that their studies can be furthered abroad, they'll jump at the chance. Despite the low-born largely being used to their lot, a few of them will try to break from society and better themselves through adventure or mercenary work. The further you get away from Alphatia proper, the more likely you'll find Alphatians willing to mingle with foreigners, even if other cultures tend to find Alphatians' attitudes towards love and marriage rather fluid, among other things. That wraps up Alphatia and the Dawn of the Emperors. All the nation books are now remastered, so I can jump into the creature crucibles. Those masterpieces of game design that gave Mystara its reputation of being the place to play really weird creatures, and often unplayable creatures at the same time. Puka, I'm looking at you. So next up is Tall Tales of the Wee Folk, considered one of the best D&D books ever, especially if you like the Fae. But until then, man, Queensryche was way ahead of its time.